Today we're going to talk about the many weapons of the ancient Greek hoplite, starting from the Archaic era and going into the Classical. Though many people assume that the Archaic and Classical era hoplite were relatively the same, there were quite a few notable differences, mainly being in the weapons that they used. You will see that I'm holding two spears here, or more a javelin, a smaller javelin designed for throwing, and another spear. However, you may also notice that this spear is actually shorter than the very famous Dory held by the hoplites. We can see in many Archaic era sources that they used actually smaller, single-ended spears. You can see this in, for instance, the Chigi vase dated to around 600-650 BC. We also see them carry in the same vase, just for ease of reference, a shorter spear, which is, in fairness, longer than this more peltast-style javelin, accompanied by the longer spear. And, of course, the famed Aspis, which does remain in the Archaic and Classical eras. The whole idea of Archaic-era warfare is rapidly changing, with more modern historians proposing a far more open and loose formational style as opposed to the sort of classical phalanx, with the inclusion of hoplites throwing javelins, and not just hoplites throwing javelins, possibly peltasts and javelin men within the ranks of the hoplites throwing forward before the armies enclose. Now you can see I can quite comfortably and easily hold a spear and the Aspis in the same hand when carrying a javelin, and this would allow me to essentially move forward in, again, a looser formation, throw my javelin and draw my spear. Now the distance you'd be throwing these likely wouldn't be too far. The furthest I've thrown this myself is about 85 feet, which is quite a distance, but is with a run up and decent form at least. It's likely that you're only maybe throwing this 50-60 feet, and that's really all you need. Before your armies close, you're ducking behind your shield and you're throwing your javelins. Then you quickly sort of probably form up tighter and you press for the close quarters engagement. Just to see, this time I've got the sharp end of the spear pointed down for ease of getting into overhand, just so you can sort of see how quickly you can throw your javelin and then get to your main weapon. So again, likely you're going to be enclosing decently close before you start throwing these. March up, throw, my spear is up. For those of you interested in Roman era warfare, this may sound quite similar, and it does share quite a lot of relations with the pilum that the Romans would carry and throw before then drawing the gladius. So that is something that we see decently commonly depicted in the Archaic era, the sort of collaboration between the Aspis, a spear, and one or two javelins as well. Let's now focus a little bit more on the Archaic era spear. Now, the Dory is typically larger, around 7 to 9 feet. This spear is quite a bit shorter, being around 6 to 7 feet. Still quite long though, and again, single-ended. Now, one thing you may notice with this guy here is that it is tapered. We do see this in the surviving spears. Basically, the socket tapers up to allow this to get, for one, friction fitted on, as well as fastened. This has also been glued inside the socket, but it also reduces weight. So because this shaft is tapered up, it reduces the weight that would have otherwise been there from the rest of the wood, which does allow me to hold the spear further back than forward. This spear is, to be honest, more versatile than the Dory because it is slightly shorter, and though it's not counterweighted strictly from the back with the Soriter, it does allow me to move incredibly quick, parry, stab incredibly quick as well. Now you will notice that I am holding it overhand. The consensus now in both the reenactment and academic community is yes, overhand was more common. However, that doesn't mean that you can't easily switch to underarm. You can rotate between them quite easily. And in the Archaic era, where again we're likely seeing more loose sort of individualized warfare, not necessarily one-on-one duels, but not the super sort of tight phalanx that we think of the hoplites using, it's likely that you would be switching from overhand to underarm and vice versa. Something important to note is when you hold it here, this is slightly further back from the balance point. My balance point is about here. But if I hold it here, you can see that it very easily, I'm not having to force this down, but the back end is well above the heads of the guys that were behind me in our formation. And when I stab, I have no real risk of hitting the guys behind me because this comes past my shoulder. You may be wondering though, well, the balance point being here must be quite annoying. Well, I have no period sources to back this up, but just through sort of experimentation with this style of spear, you can imagine that if you're closing that distance, sort of, you know, from javelins to then sort of sparring, fencing, to actually pressing closer, which likely happened, we have period descriptions of the famed othismos, which is again quite a debated topic of whether it physically means a great push of shields, whether it means sort of a tactical push, or whether it's more just close quarters when swords come out. But either way, if you press that distance and you don't have time to draw your sword, you can choke up on the spear. And because that's now where the balance point is, you can get in quite close. Basically, it is the length of a sword. So that's something that's sort of interesting. That, again, no period sources to back up that claim. It is just using a tapered, correct length spear of the sort of archaic era. It does allow me to get good range, long distance, but if I close, I can, you know, sort of choke up on the spear and get a more manageable length. So that's predominantly how the soldiers of the archaic era fought, with sort of a spear and javelin combination. Now let's look into the classical era. Coming into the sort of tail end of the archaic era, we see the development of the very famous Dory, which is the spear associated with the ancient Greek hoplites. This is your double-ended spear, has the iron acme at the front and the bronze sartor on the back end, which roughly translates to lizard sticker. And this is one thing I actually love this style of spear for. You can stick it in the ground and it stays up, which is honestly really helpful because the archaic era spear is laying on the ground, and I absolutely love how you can readily just get this and be sort of ready to fight. As I said before, these spears were typically longer, being around 7 to 9 feet. And the reason that they're double-ended has sort of multiple purposes. The one that I just said, which is arguably one of my favorites, is you can stick it in the ground. You can, of course, dispatch of fallen enemies at your feet, which could be quite a threat to you and your teammates, because as you're marching over fighting, if there's a guy on the floor who can wiggle your toes and poke your ankles, you want to be able to dispose of him. And of course, it also quite famously acts as a counterweight. You can see the balance of the spear is further back than forward, which then again allows me to get far more distance of the spear, and it's more weighted, or evenly weighted rather, I should say, at the back, which is quite a helpful addition. And there is also arguably another use for the spear, the back spear, is that if your front end is cut off or snaps, you do have another weapon. However, in formational combat, unless somehow your spear snaps very sort of far up, you would not be able to switch your spear over. Now, through tests, you can get 3 ranks maybe of hoplites using the Dory attacking, mainly just the front 2. But it is a very versatile, and it lasted several hundred years. It's a very well sort of designed spear. Now, as I said before, this is a little bit less wieldy than the smaller archaic spear, but that is because it has about 2 foot longer mass behind it. Also, this spear here, I haven't tapered it, which would, you know, make a difference in that. So I will taper it at some point, I just haven't got around to it yet. So the spear, whether you're talking the archaic or the classical era hoplite, was the primary offensive weapon. However, they didn't just stand alone. Hoplites also wielded swords. Now here I have an example of 2 swords, the Kizifos, or the English Xiphos, which is perhaps one of the most famous of the hoplite swords. This one specifically is a shorter one, famously used by the Lacedaemonians. However, that's only really in the sort of Peloponnesian War era. Most of them would have been slightly longer, especially sort of in the archaic era. We don't necessarily see the super short sword. And the Copis, which this is a falcata, which there is a difference. Many people say that the Copis and the falcata were the same. Others say they were different. I tend to be on the line that yes, there is a difference between the two. Just the shapes of the blades look different to me for every falcata versus Copis that I see. But it's a similar style sort of sword, front leafed, designed to be a cutter, whereas the Kizifos is a far more versatile sort of multi-tool of you can slash and stab with it. Not to say that this also wasn't very versatile. This was also a very popular weapon. Now, one question that we commonly get is, well, why do they have such long spears but such short swords? And that's a pretty good question. Now, one thing that we see in art sometimes is the sheath or the scabbard, whichever, is always high. That is frankly because it's just easier to draw. But we also sometimes see them holding the sword in the Aspis hand whilst holding the spear. That then, of course, allows you to very quickly switch weapons if you lose one. Now, why was it so short? Well, you can imagine if you press into someone and you get incredibly close, like shield touching shield, you want a very short weapon. So you can imagine if there's a guy here, I can ruthlessly and quickly and easily get over that shield and hitting him, stabbing him. And why it's such a small blade that can fit through eye holes, it can fit through neck holes, any gaps in his armor, this is easier to get through than a larger weapon. And similar, the coppice as well. You can get at feet, get at heads, you can stab with it as well. Really, it is quite ruthless. Once that sort of press happens, you can imagine if swords start coming over, you know, there's going to be some people getting eyes poked and necks poked and all sorts. Now, although not everyone necessarily would describe this as a weapon, this is arguably the most important aspect to the hoplite, that being the Aspis, the shield. This is a very interesting designed shield. This is made of scans of the Vatican shield, which is an archaeological find held in the Vatican Museum. However, we see different construction methods, different sizes, and even different depths of the bowl as well. This design is made of a decently historical method where I've used strips of wood. Other theories have actually posed that they could have been turned on a lathe. Others use thin sort of slats that we can again sort of see in the Che Guevaras. But it's a very bold shield. It's not very heavy. It's about 12 to 15 pounds is roughly the historical range. So lots of people think that's like a 20-pound shield. No, I mean, you don't want to do this very long, but it's not very heavy. It's quite versatile at the same time. The fighting stance for hoplites is not this. Okay, you're not hugging the shield super close to you. You're holding it out and at an angle, and your spear is here. That allows you, for one, to use your spear a lot, but you're still incredibly well covered. And we see this in the art data as well. We see statues doing this, and it's because it makes the most sense. You can move it well, you're very well protected, and it allows you freedom of motion. Now, in a phalanx, that's slightly different, but again, we typically see it held out, which gives you more space. And if it's overlapped properly, you can almost rest your hand against the rim of the shield, which allows you quick and accurate poking without tiring out your arm for holding it up so much. Something else to note about the Archaic era shorter spear is that it can also act as a javelin. You could also throw this, so if you get into that sort of close range, you decide I don't want to use the spear, you could throw it into the enemy. So it sort of has multiple purposes in that sense as well. You could throw the Dory, however it's not as practical, it's not weighted properly, and it's just more difficult to throw because it is so much longer. So that is a quick rundown on the many weapons of the Ancient Greek Hoplite. If you're interested in the armor, I previously did a video running through my entire panoply and explaining semi-in-depth sort of all of the armor, from helmets to cuirasses to greaves to all sorts, so I'll link that in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about any of the stuff I've talked about, drop a comment and I will try my best to respond to you. Thank you very much for watching this video, and a special thanks to our members Bobby, Joe, Jeff and Danny Go. We greatly appreciate your support. If you yourself would like to support the channel, of course you can watch the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel, which means a lot. But if you want to go the extra mile, we do have a memberships page where you can become a channel member and get a few benefits and support the channel. And we also have a merch store, which is all sort of inspired on historical design. So that will also be linked down below. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.